Rome, 67 AD. A city overflowing with marble, wealth, and blood. The capital of the greatest empire on earth. People there had seen it all. Gladiators ripped apart in the Colosseum. Emperors throwing orgies in golden halls. Senators poisoned at banquets without anyone blinking an eye. But on this day, the city fell into a strange and sudden hush. Word spread fast, like smoke through dry timber. Something had happened in the Forum, something that made even the hardened Roman elite stop and stare. At the center of the commotion was Emperor Nero, theatrical as ever, striding through the heart of Rome with a woman at his side. She was radiant, wrapped in silk dyed deep purple, a color so rare and expensive it was reserved for royalty. Her hair was arranged in elaborate curls, pinned with gold and pearls. Her face was painted pale and flawless, her lips a soft red, her expression poised. Everything about her screamed imperial grace. But the crowd wasn't applauding. They weren't bowing. They were stunned. Because they knew. Everyone knew. That wasn't a woman. That was Sporus, a teenage boy who had once served quietly in the palace, someone most people had barely noticed. But now he walked beside the emperor, dressed not just as a woman, but as the empress herself. The resemblance was uncanny, eerie even, and it wasn't just the clothing, or the posture, or the powdered face. It was something deeper, something far more disturbing. Because Rome hadn't forgotten Poppaea Sabina, the dazzling, dangerous woman who had once been Nero's wife. The same Poppaea who had died suddenly not long ago. The woman who had been the center of Nero's world, his obsession, the one he couldn't stop talking about, even after her death. And now, here was Sporus, a boy who looked just like her, who was made to look just like her. The people watching that day didn't know exactly what had happened behind the palace walls. They didn't know the full story, not yet, but they could sense it. They could feel the wrongness in the air, the weight of something broken and irreversible. And even in a city as hardened as Rome, where power was absolute and cruelty was routine, this felt different. What they saw was no ordinary scandal. What had been done to that boy shattered every boundary, not just of law, but of what it meant to be human. But Sporus, he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He walked calmly, step for step beside the emperor, carrying himself like a ghost brought back to life, or a prisoner who had learned to stop resisting. And Nero, he looked proud, like an artist unveiling his masterpiece, like a man who had defied death itself. This wasn't about love. This was about control, about obsession, and the lengths one man would go to rewrite reality. But what led to this moment, what drove Nero from admiration to madness, is a story far more twisted than anyone watching that day could imagine. Because before there was Sporus, there was Poppaea Sabina, and before there was silence, there was fire. Part 2 is where it begins. The Golden Girl, the affair, the betrayal, the obsession, and the act that tore the empire in half. Let's go back to where it all started. Part 1, the empress who challenged a god. When Nero first took the throne, Rome didn't brace itself. It breathed. The empire had been suffocating under years of rigid rule, and now, suddenly, the crown rested on the head of a 16-year-old who loved poetry more than war, theater more than politics. And at first, it felt like hope. Nero wasn't just young, he was electric, charismatic, curious, unpredictable in a way that felt exciting rather than dangerous. He slashed oppressive taxes, opened theaters to the public, funded games that made the streets roar. For the first time in years, the Roman people felt seen. Some even whispered that this boy king, with his golden curls and performer's grin, might just be the philosopher-artist emperor they'd only dreamed of. But the thing about Rome is that nothing gold stays gold. And behind that youthful energy, behind the laurel wreath and the soft smile, something had already begun to rot. At first, it was easy to miss. A sour note in his otherwise charming public appearances, a flash of irritation when an actor forgot a line. But then came the performances where Nero insisted on taking the stage himself, not as a gimmick, as the star. Then came the rumors of backroom purges, of rivals quietly removed. The boy who once walked among the people now moved only under armed escort. And then, like lightning striking dry ground, she appeared. Poppaea Sabina. If Nero was Rome's golden boy, Poppaea was pure fire wrapped in silk. She was already well known in court circles, not just for her beauty, which was legendary, but for her mind. Poppaea didn't need to shout to be heard. She knew the power of silence, the weapon of well-timed glances. She could enter a room and shift its entire center of gravity without saying a word. And Nero didn't stand a chance. She wasn't just different from his wife Octavia. She was everything Octavia wasn't. Where Octavia was quiet, Poppaea was magnetic. Where Octavia tolerated, Poppaea demanded. Octavia was the daughter of the previous emperor, a political match arranged to keep Nero in line. But Poppaea? She was pure ambition in human form. And Nero, already unraveling beneath the pressure of the crown, didn't just fall for her. He gave in to her. Their affair wasn't just gossip, it was chaos. Senators whispered, priests fumed, and the people watched uneasily as Nero's gaze shifted further and further from state affairs to the woman by his side. Soon after, Nero did something unthinkable. He cast Octavia aside, divorced her, despite her status, despite her bloodline. The people rioted. Statues of Octavia were paraded in protest. But Nero didn't care. His heart was locked on Poppaea. And then came the wedding. It was a spectacle, the likes of which Rome had never seen. Silk imported from Parthia, scented fountains that spilled rosewater into marble channels, musicians playing lyres all through the night. Poppaea, draped in shimmering fabric, was crowned with a cascade of petals from golden baskets. She was seated as empress, given titles, jewels, palaces. The world was hers, and Nero handed it to her with both hands, smiling as if he'd won something eternal. But passion, when mixed with power, becomes something else. Something darker. Soon, Nero wasn't just devoted. He was obsessed. He couldn't let Poppaea out of his sight. Guards followed her everywhere. Her letters were read. Her visitors monitored. Sculptors were ordered to create dozens, maybe hundreds, of statues, busts, and reliefs of her likeness. Her face began to appear everywhere, in temples, in mosaics, in private chambers. The palace started to feel like a temple built in her honor. But here's the thing about Poppaea. She wasn't the kind of woman to sit still and be worshipped. She wasn't just a symbol. She had thoughts, strategies, plans. She involved herself in policy, in diplomacy, in culture. And when Nero did something she didn't agree with, she told him. Directly. Even publicly. She critiqued his speeches, rolled her eyes at his poems, corrected his phrasing during Senate discussions. For anyone else, that might have been suicide. But for Poppaea, it was sport. Nero admired her boldness, at first, but admiration, in a man losing his grip on reality, quickly turns into fear, and fear, in an emperor, becomes something dangerous. One evening, away from the public eye, inside the quiet walls of their private villa, a conversation turned sour. No witnesses, no scrolls, just two voices, one of them raised. The details remain buried in the dust of history. Some say it was about politics. Others say Nero had returned late from a race, and Poppaea had dared to accuse him of neglect. But what happened next shattered everything. By morning, the empress was gone. And Nero? Nero was never the same again. What followed wasn't grief. It was something else. Something that would push him past the edge. Something that would pull Sporus into the darkest chapter of imperial history. And in part 2, we go there. Part 2, the face that shouldn't have returned. After Poppaea's death, the palace didn't just mourn, it froze. The same halls that once echoed with music and laughter now stood in silence. Servants moved like ghosts. Curtains remained drawn. No one spoke her name above a whisper, unless it was to Nero himself, and even then, every word was weighed like gold on a scale. Because what came next wasn't grief in the way most people understand it. It was something darker, something obsessive. Nero didn't allow her to be cremated, even though cremation was the sacred, time-honored tradition for Roman elites. Instead, he ordered her body to be embalmed, preserved like the queens of Egypt, as if he could stop time, as if he could freeze the exact moment before he lost her. She was laid in a tomb laced with gold and polished stone. An entire room was dedicated to her memory, draped in purple, scented with imported incense, filled with offerings. But that wasn't enough. Nero deified her. He declared Poppaea a goddess, not in metaphor, but in legal, imperial ritual. Her image was placed beside divine statues, her name spoken in prayers. Her seat at state banquets remained untouched, preserved as though she might return at any moment. Courtiers were required to refer to her in the present tense. She likes these olives. She enjoys music. She is radiant today. And then, as weeks passed, Nero himself started to fall into silence. He stopped performing, stopped governing, stopped speaking to senators. He would sit for hours in her empty chambers, staring at walls covered in her portraits. He would talk, not to ministers or musicians, but to her corpse, guarded and embalmed in its private chamber. Rome waited. The city held its breath. What happens when a god loses the only thing he worships? And then, Nero saw him, a boy. Not on a battlefield, not in the Senate, but right inside his own palace. A quiet servant, one of dozens, just 15 years old. Slim build, sloping shoulders, pale skin, eyes wide and glassy with youth. But it wasn't his age that caught the emperor's attention. It was his face. There was something haunting in the way the boy looked, something eerily familiar. His cheekbones, his jawline, the way his mouth curved, not in confidence, but in quiet restraint. Even the sadness in his expression seemed familiar. And Nero saw her, not metaphorically. He saw Poppaea, in that boy's face, as if the universe had carved her again out of new flesh and sent her back as a sign. The boy's name was Sporus, a former slave, born into the imperial household, freed not long ago for his loyal service. He wasn't high-ranking, wasn't noble, just a quiet, educated child who had spent his life learning how to keep his head down. He knew languages. He knew how to dress the court properly. He knew how to listen. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that from that moment forward, his life would never again belong to him. Nero fixated on him, not with curiosity, not with grief, with purpose. He summoned his personal physicians, the most skilled doctors in all of Rome, the same men trusted to treat generals and senators. And without public announcement, without warning, Sporus was taken from his quarters and led through a narrow stone corridor deep into the private chambers beneath the palace. No ceremony, no farewell, just a command, and a door that closed behind him. What happened next wasn't recorded in detail, not even by Rome's boldest historians. But some things don't need to be written down to be understood. Sporus underwent a procedure, one so extreme, so irreversible, that afterward he was no longer considered a young man by Roman law. The surgery likely took place without anesthesia. The empire, for all its glory, knew little of pain relief. And deep beneath the palace, far from the eyes of senators and citizens, time stood still. Whether it lasted an hour or a day, we may never know. But what's certain is this: when it was over, the boy who had entered that chamber would never come back out. He wasn't greeted with comfort or care. He wasn't allowed time to recover in peace. Instead, he was handed robes, not tunics, not the uniform of a servant, but embroidered silks, dresses fitted to his altered body, jewelry once owned by Poppaea, rings slid onto his fingers, kohl traced under his eyes. His hair was oiled and curled, his skin powdered to match the ideal tone of Roman femininity. Cosmetics were applied not with art, but with intention, to blur what remained of the boy underneath. And then came the new name, Sabina, the name Poppaea had carried before her death, now passed on like a title, like a mask. From that moment on, Sporus, the boy who had once walked palace halls in silence, was expected to walk them again, but this time as someone else entirely. And what came next wasn't recovery, wasn't freedom. It was a wedding. Part 3. The Livying Reflection. The wedding took place in early spring, that season when Rome briefly softens, when even the blood-stained stones of the Forum seem to breathe with color and light. It should have been a time of renewal. Instead, it became something else entirely. By imperial decree, the palace was transformed. Courtyards were swept clean until they shimmered like polished glass. Rose petals from Alexandria were scattered across the marble floors. Bronze braziers glowed from every alcove, filling the air with burning frankincense and heavy perfume. Torches flickered along the long hallways, their flames casting distorted shadows on the walls, shadows that didn't dance so much as loom. In the grand atrium, where senators once debated and generals had been honored, an altar had been raised. Draped in gold, framed by columns wound in silk, it stood like a stage, and on that stage, the most powerful man in the world waited in ceremonial robes. Nero stood tall, chin lifted, his hands trembling only slightly beneath his layers of crimson and ivory. And beside him, wearing a bridal veil, stood Sporus. No one in the room breathed. He had been dressed in the finest fabrics Rome could offer. His gown was sewn with threads imported from the East, embroidered with birds of paradise and twisting vines. Sapphire earrings dangled from his ears. His hair was curled into tight, polished waves and pinned with ivory combs. His face was dusted with white powder, his lips painted a soft rose, and his eyes ringed in kohl to widen and feminize their shape. To anyone unfamiliar with his story, he looked like a young bride, delicate, composed, otherworldly. But to those who knew who he was, and what he was, the sight was unthinkable. And yet, the ceremony began. It followed every tradition of Roman marriage, down to the final detail. The vows were spoken in formal Latin, the ancient hymns sung by a choir of boys from the temple of Jupiter. Bread was broken and shared, a symbol of unity. A legal contract was signed in ink, sealed with the emperor's personal mark. Witnesses nodded, not in joy, but in fear. Because in that room, behind the flowers and the music and the forced smiles, a single truth pressed down on every guest like a stone. This was not a wedding. This was a performance. And they were all part of the act. The guests clapped when they were supposed to. They smiled for the emperor. They gave polite nods to Sporus, now introduced as Sabina, the new empress of Rome. But their eyes, cold, darting, silent, told another story. One of unease, of horror, of submission. Because in Nero's Rome, to question the script was to disappear from the stage altogether. After the wedding, Sporus was moved into private imperial quarters, once reserved for real empresses. His name was added to ceremonial rolls. He was assigned a personal guard, a household of attendants, stylists, scribes. A gilded litter carried him through the streets. He no longer walked. He was paraded, draped in veils, shaded by parasols, flanked by armed men. The same people who once ignored him now bowed as he passed. But none of this was luxury. It's a mirror, a warning, about what happens when power is allowed to go unchecked, about what people in power will do, not out of love, but out of control, grief, and obsession, and about the quiet, often invisible courage of those it tries to erase. Because even in the darkest corners of history, in the shadows behind golden thrones and blood-soaked altars, there are voices that still speak. Sporus's voice is one of them. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, not sanitized, not buried, but heard, then don't scroll away. Subscribe. Stick around. Because this was just one forgotten voice, and there are so many more still waiting to speak.